Hello there, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Ciadello.
This week, could the Stormy Daniels hush money case be the first to bring a criminal conviction of Donald Trump? And if so, what next?
How about World War III, John? In which case it probably doesn't matter that Washington's broken and America's democracy is a farce. But first...
The first officially sanctioned Democratic primary in South Carolina was on the weekend, and it was a walkover for President Joe Biden, scooping up 96% of the vote. Those are Putin numbers. According to the Associated Press, he won 9 in 10 black voters, winning every county and all 55 delegates. Biden hardly campaigned in the state at all and literally phoned it in after his win, Democratic Party Chair Jamie Harrison putting the president on speakerphone.
Well, thanks, everybody. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And you're not rid of me. I'm coming back.
And there was an interesting footnote to Biden's South Carolina win. Congressman Jim Clyburn, whose endorsement sealed Biden's win in the Palmetto State in 2020, now wants the DNC to reverse its decision not to count delegates elected last week in New Hampshire, despite the party punishing the state for going first.
Let the Rules Committee figure out a way to let those Democratic delegates up in New Hampshire have their vote at the convention.
Interesting timing, given that Joe Biden actually won the delegates in New Hampshire as well.
It did. Look, there's probably not a lot you can take out of either of these primaries. The Democrats were hoping that South Carolina would show black voters turning out for Joe Biden in large numbers, and the share of black voters on the day was 13% higher than it was in 2020. They were 69% of the voters in this primary, but really, turnout was just too low to mean anything. In 2016, 370,000 people voted in the Democratic primary. In 2020, it was 540,000. This time, it was a quarter of that, 131,000, which is fine. There was no contest, really, was there? But let's just all move on, hey?
Well, as far as the Republican primary race is concerned, it's getting complicated this week, particularly in the state of Nevada. A state-run primary was held yesterday where Donald Trump wasn't on the ballot, but Nikki Haley was, and so was former Vice President Mike Pence, even though he dropped out of the race ages ago. So it was basically meaningless. Tomorrow, a caucus will be held in Nevada where Trump is on the ballot, but Nikki Haley is not. The problem for Nikki Haley is that the primary won't award delegates. The caucus will. And there are 2 votes because the Nevada Republican Party is unhappy that no voter ID is needed for the primary. And it also allows pre-poll voting and same-day voter registration. Here's Party Chair Michael McDonald to explain.
We have to have some type of voter ID. We'd like to have election day, not election week, not election month, and put that together. It is not a show of protest. It's a show of how it can be done, it should be done, so it's fair and open.
More than a protest, it is an old-school schmozzle that even some Republicans fear is going to fuel voter concerns about the legitimacy of all elections. That state-run primary, by the way, also had Democrats on the ballot, and that too was pretty much a waste of everybody's time. Meanwhile, there was a sort of good news, bad news poll for Donald Trump this week. A national NBC News poll has him leading President Biden by 5 points, 47 to 42. But when pollsters asked what their choice would be if Trump were to be found guilty and convicted of a felony this year, he falls behind Biden by 45 to 43.
I don't know, John. I'd be calling that poll good news, better news for Trump. Because you're telling me the bad news for Trump is that if he's convicted of a felony and he's on his way to jail, he might just lose an election by 2 points, which is less than the margin of error for that poll. That's a pretty good poll result for Trump, I'd have to say. And it gets better for Trump. One poll doesn't mean much, but trends over time mean a bit more. And this is the last 6 months of results from the NBC poll. Biden started off 4 points ahead, but there was a tie, and now Trump's in the lead, doing better and better, even as the economy continues to improve. Talking about which, Trump holds a 22-point lead over Biden at the moment on who would handle the economy better in an NBC poll. He holds a 35-point lead on who would secure the border and control immigration better, and he holds a 16-point lead on who would be more competent and effective. Ouch. Meanwhile, Biden's approval rating in this poll has dropped off to 37%, the lowest point of his presidency. And at 35%, it's even lower amongst Latinos. 29% amongst young voters, 27% amongst independents. Finally, Biden's economic approval has gone down 2 points despite the excellent economic news lately. His foreign policy approval has dropped a point. He only has a 29% approval on his handling of the Gaza war, down a whopping 5 points since the last poll. This is a terrible poll for Biden overall, but right now polling, it doesn't mean a lot because the two key groups, young voters and independents, are all over the place in these polls. Take young voters. Polls have found just this week, Biden's up amongst young voters by 3, by 14, by 20, by 9, and by 2. Those are all from the same week. As for independents, Quinnipiac found Biden leading amongst independents by 12. CNN found him down amongst them by 4. Bloomberg had him down amongst them by 8. And NBC just now found Biden trailing amongst independents by 19 points. So maybe we should wait for the polls to settle down just a tad before people get too excited, especially given everything's about to change anyway as soon as Trump's trials begin. How do we know that? Because believe it or not, a lot of people aren't even aware these trials exist yet. YouGov simply asked people if they were aware of Trump's indictments. And you can see there that the Biden voters on the right are very aware of these indictments because left-wing media is all over them, of course. But about half of Trump voters had no idea about the 3 major trials coming this year that Trump is facing, and the independents knew even less. So at some point in time, everyone is going to know about these trials. And what happens then? It's anyone's guess, John.
Yeah, it certainly is. Of all the legal cases and the 91 indictments facing Donald Trump right now, one is generally viewed as among the strongest and the most likely to lead to a pre-election conviction. This one has been put on indefinite hold, though, the so-called January 6th case brought by Special Counsel Jack Smith, alleging essentially that Trump tried to defraud voters by stealing the 2020 election. It's being overseen by DC Judge Tanya Chutkan, and it was due to start on March the 4th, but not anymore.
It was pushed because we're still waiting on a decision from the federal appeals court in D.C. considering whether Trump is absolutely immune from federal criminal prosecution.
Well, this week, that appeals court ruled against Trump's immunity claim. He is not immune. This is now likely to head to the US Supreme Court, possibly by way of another series of appeals, which will all push the January 6th case much closer to November's election with some unknown consequences.
Although they won't push that case as close to November as they would have before that appeals court ruling. So for those looking forward to some kind of trial, this is good news.
Yeah, the wheels of justice are slowly turning. The other case involving Trump's alleged attempts to overturn the last election does look in danger of falling apart. This is in the wake of a sex scandal.
Fulton County District Attorney FANI Willis admitted to a personal relationship with an outside prosecutor she appointed to manage the election interference case against former President Donald Trump.
Well, put it like that, it sounds a bit dodgy. Trump now wants this case against him thrown out entirely because he claims that FANI Willis benefited financially from an improper, clandestine personal relationship with Nathan Wade. He is a lawyer that she hired to lead this investigation into Trump. Trump's lawyers now allege that Willis overpaid Wade, who they say was unqualified for the job in the first place, and some of that money was spent on Willis in the form of flights and vacations. Willis says that those claims are fantastical theories and rank speculation. Trump, however, takes a different view.
Fannie Willis and her lover perpetrated a conspiracy to make money, cheat, and interfere with the presidential election of 2024. This case is a hoax, just like Russia, and all of the rest.
It's another hoax.
It's all a hoax, John. Now, look, firstly, we should make clear to the hoax people that if FANI Willis is removed from the case, that is not the end of the case. Someone else would then be asked to prosecute the case, but that could take months, if not years, well past the election. Secondly, while the affair is excellent, juicy goss, it's not actually the legal issue here at all. Like you said, it's whether FANI Willis benefited financially from appointing her boyfriend to be the prosecutor. So, it is relevant that Nathan Wade, the boyfriend in question, said in his affidavit that his relationship with Willis began after she hired him. And he also said that when they travelled together, their personal travel expenses were roughly divided equally between them. So Willis did not financially benefit. In fact, he said that Willis received no funds or personal financial gain at all from his position as prosecutor. However, their accusers reckon they have witnesses who will testify to having seen them living together and that their relationship began before Wade was hired. So look, we'll see where the evidence leads, but all that really matters are the financial elements, not the affair. We need to be clear about that.
And the fact as well, remember, this is a state case, not a federal case. Trump cannot pardon himself if he's convicted on these charges, so they could be hanging over his head for quite a while, whatever happens in the election. But with all of that up in the air, it does now look as though the first case to be brought against Trump last year could now end up being the first case to go to trial after all. This is the case brought last April by the Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg. He alleged 34 felonies relating to the falsification of business records.
Under New York state law, it is a felony to falsify business records with intent to defraud and an intent to conceal another crime.
So basically, Bragg is claiming that Trump was fiddling his accounts to obscure hush money allegedly paid to adult performer Stormy Daniels to stop her talking about their alleged affair. And because that cover-up was to hide the truth from voters before the 2016 election, the crime to cover up a crime elevates this from a misdemeanor, which can go away quite easily with a fine, to a felony, which can lead to jail time. It is a crime. The case is slated for March 25th. Bragg has indicated that while he could put it all on hold if one of those federal cases was ready to roll, because they're not, it looks like it's going to be hush money and porn stars for the next little while, Chaz.
Yeah, look, and as you say, it's a pretty straightforward fine for Trump here for a misdemeanor. The question is, can they get that felony happening that you referred to? For that, they need to show that Trump falsified business records with the intent to commit or conceal another crime, a different crime. Violating campaign finance laws, that's a crime, but that's federal law, not state law, and this is a state charge. So can a state prosecution use a federal law to justify the felony? We don't know. No one's ever tried to do this before. This is a first, so it could go anywhere. In other words, this case could become quite technical. So should we maybe talk to someone who knows what they're talking about as opposed to me?
Let's lawyer up. And joining us is Robert MINTZ. He's been involved in a lot of organised crime cases, also some white-collar and criminal law defence cases. And he's with us from Newark, New Jersey. Robert MINTZ, welcome to Planet America.
Thanks for having me.
So, in your opinion, how significant a ruling is this from the appeals court that Donald Trump is not immune from prosecution?
Well, the real significance here is not so much in the result, which was expected by everybody, but in the fact that it was actually decided, because part of the Trump defense team strategy is to try to delay this case as long as possible and hopefully push the trial to after the November election. So the prosecution team here was trying to move this immunity decision ahead as quickly as possible. In fact, the special prosecutor, Jack Smith, even tried to get the Supreme Court to hear the case directly, skipping the appeals court. Supreme Court declined to do that, but now the Court of Appeals has ruled in favor of the prosecution, has said there is no presidential immunity that attaches to the activities on January 6th, and therefore this case will now proceed either to an en banc hearing, which is a hearing before the entire District Court of Appeals, or eventually the Supreme Court. And if you're the prosecutor here, you're hoping that that happens as soon as possible.
So, Robert, the Trump defence tactic is clear for all to see. Delay, try and push it past November. Is there a countervailing pressure for the courts themselves to try and clear up some of these matters, to reach verdicts before November so the voters can ultimately deliver their own verdicts at the ballot box?
Well, that is a great question because, typically courts are supposed to be insulated from all political considerations. They're not really supposed to look at these outside influences. But I think in this case, it's just impossible for them not to be mindful of the fact that there is an election coming up and that voters will likely want to know the results of at least some of these trials before the election. So I do think that the Court of Appeals made their decision fairly quickly, and we'll see the Supreme Court also make a quick decision here if it ultimately gets appealed to them and if they decide to hear the case.
Okay, let's talk about the Manhattan District Attorney case. Now, I've been led to believe by the media that for that to be a felony, prosecutors need to show that Trump's falsification of records was trying to either commit or conceal another crime. First of all, is that true? And secondly, do we have any sense of what that crime might be at this point in time?
Well, the problem with the DA's case is it is built on a foundation that is a bit of a novel theory that has never really been tested by the Court of Appeals. And as a prosecutor, you're always wary about proceeding on a novel theory because there's two problems there. Number one, it's possible that the trial court or the Court of Appeals could ultimately throw out the case entirely on procedural grounds. In other words, decide that the legal theory is in and of itself deficient and you don't even get to the evidence in the case. So that's one potential pitfall. The other potential pitfall is that even if it moves up the chain, there's a conviction, it goes on appeal, ultimately that case could wind up before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has a rule which basically says that in criminal cases, there has to be sort of a clear-cut description of what is a crime and what is not a crime. In other words, it's fair for somebody to have notice if their conduct may violate a criminal statute and could arguably send them to jail. And so if there's any ambiguity in that statute, if there's anything unclear about whether something is legal or illegal, the Supreme Court is liable to read that statute very narrowly, and that could pose a problem for prosecutors.
And if Trump is found guilty in this case, what kind of punishment is he looking at? Are we talking about jail time here?
Well, there's 34 counts charged, and under state law, each of them carries a penalty of up to 4 years in jail. But that's misleading because in state court, if you're a first offender, a Business Records Act case is not likely to result in any jail time. He would be considered a convicted felon, but he's unlikely that he'll go to jail based on the case in Manhattan.
Robert Mintz, thanks for sharing your expertise and joining us on Planet America.
My pleasure.
Meanwhile, back in Washington, the long-awaited bipartisan Senate bill bundling together funding for border security, immigration reform and funding for various conflicts, including Israel and Ukraine, was finally unveiled this week.
The $118 billion package provides $60 billion to help support Ukraine, $14.1 billion for Israel, $4.8 billion to deal with China's growing reach, and perhaps the most important ingredient, $20 billion to fund a series of changes to the U.S. migration system.
President Biden called on Congress to immediately pass the bill and send it to his desk to sign into law. But former President Donald Trump is not on board.
Only a fool or a radical left Democrat would vote for this horrendous border bill.
Lead Republican negotiator Senator James Langford, though, is pushing back against members of his own party, including Trump, who claim that this bill somehow automatically waves 5,000 illegal immigrants through each day.
Some people are thinking that this is somehow like counting 5,000 people in every day and releasing them. That's absurd.
And of course, Trump is not the president. Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson, he takes orders from nobody.
Is Donald Trump calling the shots here, Mr. Speaker?
Of course not. He's not calling the shots. I am calling the shots for the House.
Okay, so Mike is calling the shots, and his call...
If this bill reaches the House, it will be dead on arrival.
Right, so we'll see in the next few days if this bill even makes it out of the Senate, Chaz, because without a Senate vote, there's not going to be a House vote, and without either, of course, it's going absolutely nowhere.
And with the Republican leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, advising behind the scenes Republicans to not vote for it in the Senate either, that's not going to help either.
Really is dead on arrival. Turns out Mike's right.
Yeah, look, I got to say, I do feel a bit sorry for James Langford, the Republican negotiator in the Senate there, because this 5,000 migrant limit is not the reform. The reform is making asylum harder to get, closing a bunch of loopholes and funding way more asylum officers, detention positions and deportations to get the border under control. The 5,000 migrant limit is just a temporary backstop in case the actual reform doesn't immediately work. As Langford put it, the status quo right now is when the border is overwhelmed, we release everyone. But this bill switches that to when the border is overwhelmed, we remove everyone. And even Trump accepts that you need to change the law to fix the use of asylum. At least he did accept that back in 2019.
What the Democrats should be doing now is they should be changing the loopholes. They should be changing asylum. I've been talking to you about this for a long time. They should be changing asylum. There's so many things now.
Well, they're trying to change it. Now, to be clear, I actually get why some Republicans aren't fans of this bill. There are a number of provisions in that bill that I can totally understand why Republicans wouldn't like it, okay? But if you reckon...
We have the worst border probably in the history of the world.
In the history of the world, John? That includes like Genghis Khan.
Sure.
Then some improvements are better than none. And there are some improvements here. But look, let's face it, the criticisms of this bill are not primarily about immigration policy. Most of the people against it came out against it before they saw the bill. Coincidentally, those same people seem to be against the Ukraine war funding that's attached to this bill. Finally, let's not forget what Congressman Troy Neal said about the prospect of this bill last month before it came out again. He said, "I'm not willing to do too damn much right now to help a Democrat and to help Joe Biden's approval rating. I will not help Democrats try to improve this man's dismal approval ratings." Let's face it, it's an election year, isn't it?
Yeah, it's one of the more truthful things we've heard from a politician in a while. And now, the funny thing of it is that while American presidents can't spend a cent on things like border security or immigration reform without getting it through Congress, they can blow things up pretty much any time they like. And this week, President Biden did quite a lot of it.
A US airstrike on armed groups linked to Iran. One of dozens across Iraq and Syria.
In the end, more than 85 targets claiming dozens of lives among militia groups and various proxies linked to the Iranian National Guard. This wave of attacks from B-1 bombers, which flew directly from the United States, was in retaliation for last week's drone strike against a US base in the north of Jordan that killed 3 US service members. The US and Great Britain also intensified their bombing campaign against Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen this week. Political reaction was mixed. Speaker Mike Johnson says they didn't go far enough, while the Pentagon says, oh, don't worry, there's more where that came from.
We need to make absolutely clear to Iran that nothing is off the table.
What you saw on Friday night was just the first round.
But the Biden administration is keenly aware of the risks of a wider conflict. Secretary of State Antony Blinken issuing this rather sobering assessment.
I would argue that we have not seen a situation as dangerous as the one we're facing now across the region since at least 1973, and arguably even before that.
And by 1973 there, he's referring to the Yom Kippur War when Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. And for a time, that conflict threatened to escalate. The US was supporting Israel, and it could have brought them in direct conflict with the Soviet Union, which was resupplying arms to Syria and Egypt, including shipping nuclear weapons into the Middle East region. And the danger of a superpower war was heightened by the fact that, at least according to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, at the time, President Nixon was so overwhelmed by the Watergate crisis that he was too drunk even to speak to allies like the British Prime Minister Ted Heath. And Nixon got Syria and Egypt all mixed up. So at least Joe Biden is a teetotaler, Chaz.
Well, that is one thing. Look, it is quite a tightrope that Biden is trying to walk on at the moment. He's simultaneously being criticised for being too passive and for being too aggressive. Take this on Fox News on February 3.
This technology demonstration that we did is really just, as Michael Watts put it, a fireworks display.
And then 24 hours later, they were running with this angle.
They point out something I think we've all been thinking about here this morning and articulate. It is Michael Goodwin in an op-ed that's entitled, "Joe Biden is playing with fire in the Middle East and risking World War III."
And an hour after that, they were running with both angles simultaneously.
And you're seeing more and more headlines like this. Appeasement Joe is risking World War III. I keep seeing World War III in more and more headlines and speeches.
There's not a lot of consistency there. Although, credit where it's due, Tucker Carlson has, at the very least, stayed pretty consistent. Carlson highlighted a few Republicans calling for escalation, and then he reacted in a fairly unambiguous fashion. The truth of this situation, though, I think was best expressed by retired General Frank McKenzie, who said, if we want to prevent escalation, we need to leave the theatre. If our primary goal is to not have something escalate, we need to get out. That's obviously not our primary goal, so we need to get comfortable with the fact that there can be escalation associated with this. Hard to argue with that, John.
No, wouldn't dare. Now, before we go, how about we bust some malarkey?
That's a bunch of malarkey.
You might recall on last week's Planet America, we talked about this alt-right-wing freak-out over Taylor Swift and the batty conspiracy theory that she's a part of a PSY-OP, or a psychological operation to influence public opinion in favour of Joe Biden. Now, this theory does get pretty silly pretty fast. The Super Bowl is being rigged, they say, so that her football-playing boyfriend, Travis Kelce, wins. He then proposes to her on the field. She says yes, and then using all of the media attention, she tells young people to go and vote for old Joe Biden. The Super Bowl is this Sunday between Kelce's Kansas City Chiefs and the San Francisco 49ers, so we'll see if he actually wins. As for the evidence that Taylor's a part of a PSY-OP, well, basically, one, she's very popular. She did win the Best Album for the 4th time this week at the Grammys. And 2, this clip.
You came in here wanting to understand how you just go out there and counter an information operation. The idea is that social influence can help encourage or promote behavior change. I include Taylor Swift in here because she's she's a fairly influential online person. I don't know if you've heard of her.
Okay, so what did we just see? Somebody, like a PowerPoint presentation, talking about online influence, misinformation, and Taylor Swift at the end there? Well, Jesse Waters on Fox News claims this is what it's about.
The Pentagon PSY-OP unit pitched NATO on turning Taylor Swift into an asset for combating misinformation online. This is nothing new. In the 1950s, the government strong-armed Louis Armstrong into doing propaganda tours across Africa. In the 70s, Nixon enlisted Elvis in his war on drugs. He gave the king a badge and named him a covert federal law enforcement agent.
Well, that's some pretty questionable rewriting of history there, Jesse. But fun fact, Elvis did actually turn up uninvited at the White House, and Nixon was glad to get that photo with him, probably for the same reason I'm sure Joe Biden likes Taylor Swift supporting him. It could get him some younger votes. But that piece of evidence that Taylor Swift is a Pentagon asset is simply false. She's a research engineer named Alicia Marie Barger from Johns Hopkins University. There is no evidence that she does now or ever has worked for the US government. And this week, the Pentagon took the rather extraordinary step of issuing a statement saying, quote, Taylor Swift is not part of a DoD, Department of Defense, psychological operation, period. Or in other words, Chaz, it is malarkey, pure and simple malarkey. Let's just hope it doesn't lead to some unhinged person turning up with a loaded gun like the Pizzagate conspiracy theory did.
Yeah, we certainly don't want any violent, delusional people, John. There's enough non-violent, delusional people out there at the moment, like Alison Steinberg from the One America News Network, who had a somewhat religious take on it all.
Well, yeah, Soros might own her music, but the devil surely owns her soul. I mean, let's be real here. This is bread and circuses on steroids. Major League Sports, in and of itself, is nothing but a PSY-OP. Just imagine for a moment if people were as dedicated to Jesus as they are professional sports. I think the country might look pretty different if that were the case. And perhaps that's why we're witnessing the crumbling and degradation of our once great nation.
Whoa! Apparently, John, the entire sports industry is a PSY-OP designed to thwart Jesus.
Okay.
But look, I've saved the most delusional person until the end. Jack Posobiec, conservative activist, who's come up with a cunning plan to launch a PSY-OP of his own.
And by the way, we can do this as well. We don't have a Taylor Swift on our side, but you know who we have? We have Kid Rock, we have Ted Nugent, we have influencers, right? We have all these people, John Voight, that maybe we even ask them, you guys mind doing a little tour later this year? You doing anything this fall? And I don't know where, but maybe I could think of a couple of states.
Ted Nugent, Taylor Swift. Good luck with that, Jack. That's it for another trip to Planet America, though. We'll see you back here at the same time next week.
And don't forget the Fireside Chat on Friday night on ABC News, iView, and all the internet places.
Bye-bye.